Join me as I dive deep into the mystery and try to uncover what really happened when the Roman Empire fell into darkness. Please like and subscribe for more videos. A quiet sunset over Rome. Imagine Rome at sunset. The streets aren't bustling as they once were, and the markets hum faintly instead of shouting. The forums, where politicians once bellowed, are quiet. Even the fountains trickle more softly than in the old days. If you squint just right, you could almost believe the empire is asleep. And in a way, it is. Just not in the way you might expect. Rome didn't fall in a single catastrophic explosion. It faded, gently, quietly, like a candle burning down to its last few curls of smoke. In this first chapter, we're going to drift through the final centuries of the empire, not with the clang of swords or the thunder of invading armies, but with the soft, almost imperceptible whispers of an empire slowing down. Rome's decline wasn't dramatic. There were no massive earthquakes shaking the foundations of civilization. There were no apocalyptic storms sweeping across Europe. There were just small, quiet signs that the world was changing. And that's exactly what made it so powerful and so easy to miss. The empire stretched across 3 continents, from the rolling hills of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the mountains of Spain to the busy streets of Constantinople. Rome was enormous, and holding an empire that big together is like trying to hold a pile of sand in your hands. A little slip here, a little drift there, and eventually it spreads into something unrecognizable. The infrastructure was magnificent. Roads connected far-flung cities. Aqueducts carried water across valleys. Cities sparkled with life, or at least they did, once. By the late empire, these roads and cities were still impressive, but they were quieter, less polished, less lived in. People went about their days much as they had for centuries. Farmers tilled fields, bakers baked bread, soldiers marched to distant forts, and politicians gave speeches that no one listened to. At first, the changes were subtle. A toll booth closed. A small town stopped sending taxes. A legionary retired without being replaced. These tiny gaps, unnoticed at first, began to add up. The empire was losing strength in increments so small that daily life seemed almost unchanged. And yet, underneath it all, the foundation was shifting. Money was one of the first signs. Coins that once shined brightly now looked dull and thin. Inflation crept in quietly. Merchants found it harder to trade goods across provinces because money didn't hold the same value it used to. Markets that had been filled with chatter and laughter now hummed in softly murmurs. People started relying more on bartering or personal networks and less on imperial systems. Rome, once the heartbeat of the known world, was starting to pulse slower. Even the emperors couldn't fix this quietly growing problem. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, rulers changed often. Some were ambitious and strong, but most were, they were tired or old or simply unlucky. One day an emperor would rise to power, and a few months later he would disappear. Sometimes it was assassination, sometimes illness, sometimes forced retirement. The result was political instability, a gentle but persistent wobble at the empire's core. People still carried on with their lives, but they could sense something fragile in the air, like walking on a bridge that creaks softly with every step. And yet, the empire wasn't silent in the sense of empty. Life continued, softly humming along. Children played in the streets, merchants exchanged goods in marketplaces, scholars in distant libraries copied scrolls by candlelight. Rome's culture, the language, the architecture, the laws, remained intact, like a melody that still plays as the orchestra quietly leaves the stage. The empire's decay was not loud, it was subtle, almost polite. It slipped in while the people went about their daily routines, and that's why history often misses it at first glance. At the edges of the empire, life started to shift in slower, quieter ways too. Soldiers stationed in far-off provinces noticed fewer recruits. Villages once thriving began to shrink. Trade routes were less reliable. Invaders weren't storming cities in dramatic fashion yet. They were wandering, migrating, blending with local populations, and quietly tipping the balance. It was like a gentle tide that slowly reaches the shore. You don't notice the water rising until your feet are wet. The cities themselves reflected this soft decline. Rome, once home to over 1 million people, saw its population fall. Buildings that had housed bustling shops and lively forums now stood partly abandoned. Streets were less crowded. And in this quiet, small things became noticeable. The rustle of leaves through an empty square, the distant sound of a cart on cobblestones, the faint echo of a child's laughter that seemed louder in the stillness. Life didn't stop, it just whispered. Even cultural life continued in these hushed tones. People still celebrated festivals, still performed rituals, still sang songs in honor of gods, both old and new. Yet there was a certain softness to everything, a gentle fading of intensity. The grand spectacles that had once stunned visitors were fewer and smaller. Gladiators still fought, but the arenas were quieter. Senators still debated, but their voices carried less weight. The empire was losing energy, not with a crash, but with a slow, almost respectful bow. Religion became one of the empire's quiet anchors. Christianity spread gradually, taking root in communities and offering comfort, guidance, and order during times when secular authority wavered. Temples and churches became spaces of soft ritual, where voices rose gently in prayer rather than in political argument. For many citizens, these rituals provided a sense of continuity, a reassuring presence as the empire shifted beneath them. And here's the curious thing. This soft, almost imperceptible decline made the eventual fall seem sudden only in hindsight. From the inside, life felt ordinary. People woke up, worked, ate, went to bed. They noticed coins were lighter, soldiers were fewer, and emperors came and went, but it didn't feel apocalyptic. It felt normal. And perhaps that is why history remembers Rome's fall as such a shock, even though it had been slowly slipping away for generations. So, as the sun sets over the empire, imagine this: the orange glow spilling across quiet streets, citizens going about simple lives, children playing near fading fountains, and soldiers walking home from distant outposts. Rome's heartbeat is slower now, gentler, almost sleepy. The empire hasn't crashed, hasn't exploded. It has started to dream, to drift, to slip quietly into memory. Rome's final centuries weren't marked by dramatic battles or catastrophic events. They were marked by small, quiet shifts, fading coins, tired soldiers, fleeting emperors, and whispering markets. The empire didn't vanish in a day. It drifted, like clouds across a summer sky, almost imperceptibly, leaving behind traces that still touch our world today. And with that, we leave the empire at sunset, listening to the soft, slow rhythms of life in its final centuries. In the next chapter, we'll explore the weight of the empire, how managing such an enormous realm became almost impossible, and how even the most mundane aspects of daily life started to reveal cracks in the grand Roman structure. But for now, drift with the empire into evening and notice the quiet, the almost invisible heartbeat of a world beginning to slumber.
The weight of an empire. If you imagine holding a ball the size of a watermelon in your hands, it might feel heavy, but manageable. Now imagine trying to hold a beach ball the size of your entire neighborhood. That's a little like running the Roman Empire in its later centuries. By the time we are in this chapter, Rome was enormous. From the misty hills of Britannia to the hot sands of North Africa, from the mountains of Hispania to the bustling streets of Constantinople, the empire stretched across 3 continents. And managing all that land, all those people, all those goods, well, it wasn't easy. The empire's size was both a blessing and a quiet curse. It meant influence, wealth, and resources, but it also meant a never-ending list of responsibilities. Roads had to be maintained, ports had to remain functional, taxes had to flow smoothly from remote provinces to Rome, and let's not forget the armies. Thousands of men spread across borders, needing food, pay, and leadership. Even small missteps in any one area could ripple across the empire like soft ripples in a pond. And over time, those ripples added up. The roads were one of Rome's greatest achievements, and also one of its soft vulnerabilities. Think of the Appian Way, smooth stones stretching for miles, once buzzing with carts, travelers, and traders. By the late Empire, some roads were less crowded. Toll stations fell into disuse. Towns along the route grew quieter. Not abandoned exactly, but quieter. The soft hum of daily life persisted, but the energy that had once carried Rome across the continent was fading. Taxes were another gentle, persistent problem. The empire relied on a complex system of collection, redistribution, and enforcement, but officials were stretched thin, collectors were overworked, and some simply didn't show up. Imagine expecting a letter every week and finding only a postcard every month. The system still worked, just slowly. Farmers, traders, and artisans felt it, but the effects were gradual. Coins became lighter in value, shipments arrived late, and Rome's wealth began to leak quietly through the cracks. And then there were the armies. Legions that had once marched with unshakable precision now felt strained. Recruiting new soldiers was a growing challenge. Borders were long, and soldiers stationed in remote areas often went months without seeing family or receiving full pay. Some desertions happened quietly, unnoticed, or were replaced by hired foreign troops. Rome's famous discipline remained, but it had softened in places. And with that softening came vulnerability. Even the cities themselves began to reflect the empire's weight. Rome's population, once over 1 million, was shrinking slowly. People moved to the countryside, seeking safety and stability. Markets weren't abandoned, but they weren't as lively as before. Neighborhoods felt quieter, as if the city itself had started to yawn and stretch its shoulders after centuries of constant activity. And yet, life persisted. Children still played, bakers still kneaded dough, and senators still argued, though their voices carried less conviction than before. Communication, too, struggled under the empire's immense weight. Messages that once traveled quickly by courier now took longer to reach their destinations. News arrived later, decisions were delayed, and the connection between Rome and its provinces became softer, fuzzier. It wasn't a total breakdown, it was a gentle stretching of time and space, like honey slowly spreading across a plate. The empire still functioned, but with a quiet, persistent strain. What's fascinating is that this slow pressure didn't make life feel catastrophic. For ordinary citizens, life seemed normal. Farmers woke up, tended fields, and returned home. Merchants sold wares in bustling squares, though perhaps a little less crowded than in the past. Soldiers patrolled distant borders, though their legions were thinner. Rome's famous discipline remained, but it had softened in places, and with that softening came vulnerability. Even emperors struggled with this soft, queue-like weight. They could issue edicts, make reforms, and attempt grand plans, but Rome's sheer size meant that their influence stretched thin. One new tax law might take months to reach the farthest provinces. One rebellion might flare up in a distant corner before anyone in the capital noticed. Leaders worked hard, but the empire was a heavy, complicated machine, and sometimes the gears just didn't mesh perfectly. And yet, this pressure produced its own kind of resilience. Romans adapted. Local officials learned to manage gaps in the system. Communities relied on each other for support. Soldiers learned to improvise on the frontier. People found ways to carry on, quietly holding the empire together even as its center weakened. Life continued. Markets remained open, festivals were celebrated, and stories were told in candlelit rooms about past glories. The weight of the empire also created a sense of perspective, a reminder that Rome was not invincible. Citizens may have still believed in its permanence, but they could feel subtle signs of strain: the emptying of a road, the delayed arrival of coins, a quieter forum, the distant sound of a legion marching elsewhere. It was a gentle awakening to reality, like noticing the first chill of evening after a warm day. Interestingly, this quiet weight didn't feel threatening to most people. It was persistent, yes, and sometimes frustrating, but it wasn't a crashing disaster. Rome had survived crises before: plagues, invasions, and political turmoil. In many ways, the empire felt durable, even as it softened. And that's what made the eventual fall so surprising in hindsight. From the inside, life seemed ordinary, stable, and even comforting. From the outside, history could see the slow, almost invisible decline. By the end of the 4th century, the empire was vast, complex, and quietly overextended. Roads, armies, taxes, and leaders all carried the weight of centuries. Life continued, soft and humming, but with tiny stresses accumulating. It was as if the empire were walking on a long, narrow bridge, balancing carefully while feeling the planks creak beneath every step. Nobody rushed, nobody panicked. They simply continued, one day at a time. So, as the sun sets once again over Rome, imagine its citizens carrying on gently. Farmers in the fields, bakers in the kitchens, senators in their forums, and soldiers on distant marches, all moving to the soft rhythm of empire life. The empire is heavy, yes, but it is still alive. And the quiet strength of this slow, persistent weight is exactly what makes the story of Rome's decline so fascinating. In the next chapter, we'll drift into how money, trade, and daily life started to reveal cracks, and how Rome's citizens experienced the subtle changes of their world. But for now, rest with the thought of Rome as a living, breathing organism, slowly feeling the weight of its own greatness, and doing so without drama, without noise, just a gentle, persistent pressure that would shape the centuries to come.
When gold turned to dust. If you've ever reached into your pocket, pulled out a coin, and thought, this used to look shinier, then you already understand what late Roman citizens were quietly experiencing. The empire didn't suddenly wake up one morning and discover the money had vanished. No dramatic heist, no giant hole in the treasury floor. Instead, the value of Rome's money faded, slowly, softly, almost politely. This chapter is all about how Rome's economic strength, once powerful and glittering, began to thin out, like gold rubbed smooth on an old ring. And as always, it didn't happen with noise. It happened in silence. Let's drift into the markets of the late empire. The morning sun is barely up. Merchants are setting out their stalls. There's bread, olives, wool, pottery, and the usual gossip floating in the air. Everything looks normal, but if you listen closely, you'll hear a gentle change in tone. One merchant mutters, "This coin feels lighter than last year's." Another squints at the silver and says, "Didn't these used to shine more?" And somewhere in the corner, an old man sighs, "Ah, yes, the good old days." Which, as you know, is always a sign that something is slipping. The truth is simple. Rome had a money problem, a quiet one, a slow one, but a problem nonetheless. The government needed more coins to pay soldiers, fix roads, run cities, and basically keep the empire alive. But real silver and gold were harder to come by, so officials came up with a subtle trick: mint more coins, but make them with less metal. It's kind of like stretching dough when you don't have enough. Yes, you get a bigger loaf, but it's mostly air. And so, coin by coin, year by year, Roman money grew thinner. Shiny silver became dull gray. Gold mixed with copper. And while citizens still used them, they had no choice, they could feel something was off. Merchants raised their prices quietly. Bakers charged a little extra for bread. Farmers asked for more coin for the same amount of grain. It wasn't loud inflation, it was gentle irritation inflation. Meanwhile, trade routes that once connected the entire Mediterranean began to slow. Pirates, unsafe roads, and political tension made long-distance trade a bit riskier than before. So merchants traveled less or stocked fewer goods. Scarcity made prices rise even more, and the thin coins in people's hands felt even thinner. But here's the interesting part. Most Romans didn't panic. They didn't rush into the streets shouting that the end was coming. They adjusted, as people always do. Maybe they saved their older, shinier coins and spent the newer ones first. Maybe they bartered more. "I'll trade you 3 loaves of bread for that warm shawl." Life continued. Soft changes, quiet shifts, no big crash. Even soldiers felt it. A legionary might receive his pay and think, this feels lighter. But he would still march to his post, guard the frontier, and buy his food. He would simply grumble a little more than usual. And throughout history, that's how you know something is changing, when soldiers begin to mutter under their breath. As money weakened, the government tried to fix things in all the usual ways: new tax rules, new minting laws, new ideas about how to make coins behave. But laws are just words on paper, and coins don't magically become valuable because someone said so. The economy shifted anyway, slowly and steadily, like sand trickling through an hourglass. Another quiet effect: wealthy families began storing their treasure in land instead of money. Land didn't shrink in value, land didn't get thinner, and land could grow olives, grapes, wheat, and all the good things people actually needed. So estates grew larger, rich landowners became more powerful, and as their influence rose, the government's influence quietly shrank. Rome wasn't collapsing, it was redistributing itself. Silently, softly, without drama. You can picture it as a long, slow exhale. Meanwhile, poorer citizens found life a bit harder. A loaf of bread cost more, clothing cost more. Taxes took a larger bite from their earnings, but there wasn't a single dramatic moment where everyone gasped and said, "We're doomed." It was more like waking up every week to find your favorite snack has gotten slightly smaller again. Annoying, but tolerable. Even Rome's famous grain supply, its lifeline, faced challenges. Ships still sailed from North Africa and Egypt, carrying tons of grain to feed the huge population. But storms, pirates, and political issues made deliveries less predictable than before. So some days markets were full and lively. Other days they were a little emptier. Not empty enough to panic, just empty enough to make people raise an eyebrow and say, The empire's economy was like a candle with a slow, steady burn. You don't notice it at first. The flame looks strong, warm, steady. But hour after hour, the wax shrinks, the light dims, and by the time you realize the candle is almost out, it's been happening quietly the whole time. And yet, this is important. Rome was still Rome. People still shopped, soldiers still patrolled, farmers still harvested, markets still opened every morning. The economy wasn't broken, it was just tired. Like someone carrying a heavy bag for too long, shifting the weight from one shoulder to another. It still works, but the strain is there, quietly building. By the end of this chapter in the empire's story, money had lost much of its shine. Trade had slowed, prices had risen, wealth had shifted, and yet daily life continued with its usual gentle rhythm. People laughed, gossiped, ate dinner, and told stories by lamplight. Most never realized they were living through an economic decline at all. That's the quiet magic and tragedy of Rome's fall. It rarely felt like falling. It felt like adjusting, one small change at a time. Soft, silent, almost invisible. In the next chapter, we'll drift into the world of Roman leadership, emperors who rose and fell with surprising speed, shaking the political heart of the empire, yet doing it in a way that often felt strangely calm. But for now, rest with this thought. The empire's wealth didn't vanish, it simply faded, like dust slipping between fingers, leaving behind the memory of gold that once shined brighter than the sun.
The empire that forgot how to wake up. Take a slow breath and settle in. Because in this chapter, we're drifting into the quiet, almost dreamy, early 400s. A strange era when the Western Roman Empire was still standing, but only in the way an old, tired tree manages to stand during a long winter. Upright, yes, but barely. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear the creaking. By now, Rome wasn't falling with a dramatic crash. There were no epic trumpet blasts, no fiery explosions, no final boss level. Instead, the empire was drifting, like someone who meant to take a short nap but accidentally slept through an entire decade. So let's ease into this story, slowly, calmly, like we're walking through a fog. A slow-motion crisis. You might expect an empire collapsing to look chaotic and loud, but the Western Roman Empire's decline was more like a long, slow sigh. Problems didn't arrive suddenly. They rolled in gently, one after another, the way small waves slide onto a beach at night. And the strangest part? Most people living through it didn't even realize the fall had begun. For many Romans, daily life went on as usual, buying bread, arguing with neighbors, complaining about taxes, trying to avoid the smell of public bathhouses. The empire still looked big on the map. It still had an emperor. It still collected taxes, even if it sometimes misplaced them. But behind the scenes, things were creaky. The military was shrinking. The government was broke. The borders were getting porous, like a leaky roof. And the emperors? Well, they were changing faster than dinner specials at a street tavern. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet one. A parade of tired emperors. In the early 400s, being emperor of the West was basically a part-time job with full-time stress. Most emperors ruled for a few years, some for months, and a few didn't even have time to unpack their belongings. It was like a rotating door of tired men being handed a crumbling empire and told, "Good luck." One emperor, Honorius, reigned for almost 30 years. But honestly, he wasn't much help. He spent most of his time in Ravenna, a swampy but defensible city far away from the chaos. People joked he spent more time feeding his pet chickens than ruling. Was it true? Probably not. But it tells you a lot about how people viewed the government. Sleepy, disconnected, almost absent. The empire wasn't being led. It was drifting. Barbarian allies and allies. Another thing you start seeing in this era is Rome relying heavily on foederati, foreign groups hired to fight for the empire. They were supposed to be allies, but let's just say the relationship was sometimes as shaky as a chair with 3 legs. These groups, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and many others,
were allowed to settle inside Roman territory in exchange for military service. At first, it worked well enough. They brought fresh energy to tired Roman armies. But over time, the balance shifted. Some barbarian leaders realized they had more power than the emperors they served. A few even started acting like mini emperors in their own regions. Rome needed them. They didn't always need Rome. Imagine hiring someone to fix your roof and then realizing that person now owns your entire house. That's kind of what happened. The quiet loss of territory. One of the strangest things about this period is how quietly Rome lost land. Gaul slipped away, slowly. Spain slipped away, quietly. Britain, the empire basically just stopped writing back. Roman officials kept promising help, but help never came, and the provinces learned to take care of themselves. It wasn't a dramatic farewell. It wasn't a bloody revolution. It wasn't even a fight most of the time. It was silence. People woke up one day and realized Rome wasn't really in charge anymore. The empire was still technically there, on paper, but its presence was thin, almost ghost-like. The strange calm of ordinary life. What's fascinating is how normal life stayed for many people even as the empire frayed. Farmers still farmed, markets still opened, children still chased each other through dusty streets. If someone in a small Roman village had looked around and thought, "Is the empire collapsing?" most neighbors would have shrugged and said, maybe next year. Because the fall wasn't loud. It was quiet. Almost peaceful. The truth is, empires rarely announce their endings. They fade, slowly, softly, like the way the last light of sunset disappears without anyone noticing the exact moment it's gone. The empire was slumbering, and no one knew it wouldn't wake up the same.